In a previous video, we discussed the top 10 worst cost savings ideas from General Motors, and it included everything from some features of the Olds V8 diesels to the fixed rear window glass in the 1978 A-body vehicles, to some other things as well, like the way that Chevrolet Vegas were transported on Southern Pacific Vertipack rail cars to their final destination. But the purpose of this video is going to be significantly different from that previous one. This one is going to highlight the top 10 best cost savings ideas from General Motors. Now, best cost savings ideas, you say, how can that be possible? Well, in some cases, cost savings can actually yield good results. And there are a number of instances of this. There are ways to save cost. You can just take content out. You can get more scale by selling more products or using it across more vehicles and commonizing parts. And you can just negotiate better with suppliers. But that lattermost one, we are not going to be able to discuss because we don't know historical GM negotiations with suppliers. But this is going to be a list of what I think are some of the top 10 best cost savings ideas that General Motors ever employed. And feel free to put a comment in the comments section if I forgot one that you have as a favorite. So let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have the sale of the GM A6 air conditioning compressor to other automakers. Now, the GM A6 air conditioning compressor was one of the best systems in the business, arguably the best system in the business. And anybody who's had a General Motors car from the 1950s, 60s, 70s that had this particular compressor knows that it was able to produce some damn cold air. So cold that it would definitely freeze you out. Nobody complained about the GM air conditioning systems back in the day being inadequate. In fact, on hot summer days, you often had to turn the fan speed down or even slide the temperature bar over to give you some warmer air than what was coming out of the air conditioning outlets. But this GM setup was so good, not only was it used by General Motors, but General Motors' Harrison division, which was the division that made these components, actually ended up selling them to other automakers. Most prominently, Ford, as an example, started using the A6 air conditioning compressor in 1972 on Lincolns, and it would start proliferating across the Ford lineup as the old school two-piston York-Tecumseh compressor just couldn't quite handle it in the big wagons and the big full-size vehicles and the Lincolns, and Ford wanted some better performance out of their air conditioning systems than what they had received. Now, interestingly, other even foreign automakers like Rolls-Royce and Jaguar employed the A6 compressor under hood, as you can see here in the case of a Jaguar engine that has this A6 compressor. And it was just a universally loved design. It worked well, it was reliable, it was durable. And this was one of the ways that Harrison was able to achieve cost savings because they were making a significant amount of money selling their componentry to outside companies. Now, one might say, why in the world would GM sell this to other companies? Why wouldn't they just use it as something that would make General Motors cars better than the competition? Well, I can tell you at least one element that was probably a discussion point. Harrison was a division of GM, and back then the way the GM was run was that divisions would sell their products on an intercompany basis or within the company to other divisions. So Harrison would sell its air conditioning system to Pontiac Motor Division as an example, and it would charge a certain amount for that, and it would have profit that would be paid back to the Harrison division from Pontiac or Buick or Oldsmobile. Now, one of the things that I can guarantee was that Harrison Division's profit on selling air conditioning systems externally to external customers like Rolls-Royce and Jag and Ford was much higher than it was selling internally to GM divisions. And so Harrison management probably thought that this was a great way to get more profit, make the division more profitable, and that could allow them to invest in new technologies or just make more profit. And so I think this was an ingenious cost savings, I guess I'll call it, because it allowed Harrison to get more scale. They sold more units. They made more profit. But in selling and producing more units, they also got economies of scale for GM. So that's probably how the division management looked at it. We'll sell some of these units outside. We'll make a good profit. We'll also lower our production costs on the units we sell to GM because we're getting more economies of scale on the components. And it worked out overall pretty well. So that was number 10 on the list. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have the dashboard end caps on the 1979 Seville and 1980 Eldorado. The 79 Eldorado and the 1980 Seville were all new, and they had not only new platform componentry and exterior sheet metal, but also new interiors. These were the first Cadillacs that were available with four-wheel independent suspension combined with four-wheel disc brakes. There were four-wheel disc brakes on earlier Cadillacs like Eldorados, but these cars had that independent rear suspension that endowed them with a beautiful ride and also handling. Relatively speaking, of course, these cars still were relatively mushy. They weren't great handlers, but they did ride very well. Now on the interior had this extreme hooded theme, if you will, to it. You can see in this picture that the dash has a pretty distinctive hood to it that covered the instruments as well as the vents. Now, one of the interesting cost savings was a cheap and easy way to make sure that the edges of the dashboard align with the door panels where they had to mate up. Now, this could be a very challenging thing to get that gap right so that it looked visually just correct, to ensure that you had the gap between the IP and the door perfectly executed. But Cadillac came up with an ingenious way of doing this. The end portions of the dash on the corners there are removable. They're a separate piece, and Cadillac made pieces of different lengths to basically shim the gap in between the door panel and that instrument panel. So in the factory, they would just put on the right cap with the gap associated with the door panel, and you didn't have to do any, let's say, more challenging fitment than that. It was pretty easy, pretty ingenious. It worked well. Nobody knew the difference. Great cost savings idea in terms of manufacturing processes, and I don't think the customer even knew. And in fact, these interiors actually feel very rich despite their faux wood grain trim. They look rich on the inside. They have some real stitching. They do have some vacuum form stitching, but they're just great lookers overall, and I think that was a great cost savings idea. Let's move on to number 8. And at number 8, we have that General Motors reused a significant amount of trim bits on the interiors and even exteriors of their cars. Now, remember, I said that economies of scale is a great way to save costs. And one of the things that GM was so great at in the 50s and 60s was reusing trim bits on the inside and outside across all the divisions. More specifically, take a look at these beautiful door handles in this vehicle. These could be at home. This is my 1967 Oldsmobile Delta 88 interior, by the way. But the door handles were used on a ton of GM vehicles. Didn't matter if it was a Buick or a Pontiac or a Chevrolet. And they looked at home in whatever car they were in. And that was just the beauty of it. They were beautifully designed. They looked great. And of course, GM then got the economies of scale. I believe the Turnstead division was the one that made these, as well as the exterior door handles were also reused on many GM cars across the lineup. Again, well designed, looked at home and on any car, and no one complained that they were on a Cadillac as well as a Chevrolet. They just look great and they function great. So this was a really innovative way to get cost savings through significant economies of scale. Today, it seems like every car has got a different door handle on the inside and the outside, and I don't know why they can't just commonize something so simple as a door handle. On the interior, exterior, they did it for years, and it was successful, and nobody complained, and everybody liked the looks. Oh boy, but for whatever reason, they have to have them all be different today. And, well, this was just a great way GM got some incremental cost savings back during its Halcyon era. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have an engine on this list, and that is the GM Chevrolet 4.3-liter V6, the 90-degree V6. Now, this 4.3-liter V6 was introduced for the 1985 model year as a replacement for the 4.1-liter inline 6 and the 3.8-liter 229 cubic inch, not the Buick 3.8, the Chevrolet 90-degree V6. And the 4.3 is probably the most famous of the Chevrolet 90-degree V6 lineup that included a 200 cubic incher, a 229 cubic incher, or 3.8-liter, and then this 4.3-liter V6. And it was just genius because it basically took the Chevrolet 350 and lopped off 2 cylinders and created a V6 out of it. So it had the same bore centers, could use the same valve train, could use a lot of the same internal components. And, well, they made a whole new engine out of it that was an effective replacement for other engines that had come before it. And because it had the same bore centers and a lot of the same componentry, it could use the same tooling to make the V6. It was just an overall brilliant design, and it was improved a number of times throughout the years. In the 1986 model year, there were some upgrades to the internals, and then later on in the early 90s, the 4.3 V6 would get a balance shaft, and that really made it just wonderfully smooth. It already had from the start these offset crank pins that made it even firing, something that Chevrolet division, I think, robbed from Buick when they made the Buick 3.8 liter V6 even firing before they put the balance shafts in 1988. And the 4.3 V6 was a great engine. Now, there were some variants of it that had some issues with the spider injector as an example, but the ones with throttle body injection in particular were absolutely, completely reliable. Could easily go 200,000 miles. They made good power. I mean, they would push a full-size pickup from 0 to 60 in about 10 seconds, which back in 1988, 89, that was fast. That was like old V8 style acceleration, or maybe even better. So this 4.3 really was a great engine, and it was also a cost saver because it was able to use so many of the Chevrolet 350 components. An overall really good idea, and it worked well in the applications in which it was outfitted. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the 80s and 90s era General Motors multifunction stock, and I guess we could even say into the 2000s. Now, some people are going to hate me for this, but I actually like this stock in general. There are some portions of it that I don't care for. The feel, the kind of chicken bone feel that it has when you activate the turn signal isn't always great. But the multifunction stock, I think, was actually something that was well designed. You had a turn signal, the high beam headlight flasher, the windshield washer, and if so equipped, the cruise control, all in one multifunction stock. So you had wiper controls, cruise control, windshield washers, turn signals, bright lights, all on one. And some people would prefer different stocks, like to have a separate one for the wiper. A lot of Japanese vehicles would have different stocks, turn signal on the left, wiper on the right as an example. But I thought that this multifunction stock actually worked quite well. Now, the Buff books maligned it back in the day, and I don't really think they had much valid criticism because it was ergonomically effective. Nothing was offensive about it. It was easy to activate the washer. You just pushed a little tab forward. It was easy to activate the cruise control. You depressed the end of it, and you flicked on a switch usually on most cars. It was easy to activate the wipers. You rotated it. And it was easy to activate the turn signal, which operated normally, and pull back for the bright lights. I thought it actually was a great design. And it was used for many, many, many years in GM vehicles. And even when they redesigned the stock, they kind of kept its functionality. So some people hated it. I think the only thing, like I said, that I would ding it for was not the design itself of it, but just the feel when you activated it in some cars. It just felt really cheap. And I think for a switch that made it into basically every GM car, they should have spent a little more money on the feel of it, because then it would have been completely inoffensive. But regardless, as is, I think it was a good design and definitely saved money dumping all that in one stock. Now let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have General Motors throttle body injection. Now, during this era of emission standards and in between carburetors and port fuel injection, GM came up with kind of a stopgap that was throttle body injection. Could be easily outfitted to cars that had carburetors. It even looked like a carburetor in many ways. You know, at least you had like the single barrel setup, the 2-barrel setup. They didn't really have a 4-barrel throttle body injection. It was just kind of a 1 or 2 barrel. Sometimes, you know, the cars would have 2 single barrels, like on the Crossfire injection that was employed on Camaros, Firebirds, and Corvettes in the early 1980s. But overall, the throttle body injection, despite being a stopgap, was completely reliable. Rarely did people encounter issues with it. It helped with drivability in the cold weather or the warm weather. It gave great starting. It gave good performance and emission standards. And it did all of this very reliably. Now, it wasn't the highest performing. Like I said, there was no 4-barrel throttle body setup that GM manufactured. In the V8s at best, you could get kind of this two-barrel setup, but it still performed its job admirably. And like I said, it certainly was an improvement from carburetors in that it didn't have, a choke as an example, didn't have cold weather drivability options. It was easy to start cars even below 0 degrees. And hot, it didn't have vapor lock issues. So I have to say the throttle body injection was a great stopgap measure, and it was cost effective. It was basically, you had a wet intake. You didn't have to have port fuel injection, which was pretty expensive because you had to have an injector for each cylinder. Here you had 1 or 2 injectors for the entire engine, and it worked wonderfully. They were easy to service. You could take the injectors out of the whole throttle body setup and replace them if you needed. Again, I just can't say enough about these. I think they were more reliable than a lot of the early port fuel injection systems that GM and others had. I don't think that many people had issues with the throttle bodies, and they operated off of very low fuel pressure too, like high single-digit fuel pressure. So you didn't have to have expensive fuel lines and equipment for these or high-pressure pumps. You could still use low-pressure pumps, and it worked just fine. Brilliant design overall. Unfortunately, the more stringent emission standards and more stringent fuel economy standards would require GM to transition more toward port injection on a lot of vehicles. And by the way, I'm going to exclude from my praise the spider injector that I previously mentioned. That's basically a single injector that spins around and injects fuel through these legs, if you will, of the spider. But throttle body overall, great invention. Let's move on to number 4. At number 4, we have a car, and that is the 1976 to 1979 Cadillac Seville. Now, what is the most expensive Cadillac doing on a list of greatest cost savings initiatives? Well, for those who don't know, the 76 to 79 Seville was based on the Chevrolet Nova platform and basically was a stretched Nova platform, stretched by 3 inches in wheelbase. That was the beginnings of the underpinnings of the 76 Seville when it was first introduced. So it had these very humble beginnings, didn't even have a full frame, had front and rear subframes, and relatively crude leaf spring rear suspension. For the Mopar fans, don't feel bad that I called the leaf spring rear suspension crude. We know that every single Mopar for a period of time practically had leaf spring rears, whatever. In any case, it was a relatively crude platform to begin with very humble beginnings, and Cadillac did an excellent job at transforming this platform into something that could be employed for its most expensive luxury car. Now, Cadillac was exploring using different vehicles as the basis for the Seville when it was first going to be introduced, including an Opel platform. That was shelved, and they were looking for an alternate solution and settled on the Nova. And when it was first introduced, the car was thought to be priced lower, like the lowest entry-level Cadillac. But it clinicked so well, and people reviewed it so favorably that Cadillac decided to slot it as the most expensive car. And you have to imagine how controversial this was at a time when automakers thought that the more expensive the car was, the larger it had to be. Here was the most expensive car in the lineup, and it was the smallest. And it proved to be a tremendous success. People were ready for a so-called internationally sized car. But it came from those very, let's say, pedestrian beginnings. And I have to say, though, from the Nova platform, Cadillac really did transform it. If you've driven one of these 76 to 79 Sevilles, they actually drive really well. They're very quiet. There's no creaks and moans and rattles. They have a stiff body structure, a seemingly stiff body structure. This was one of the first times that Cadillac employed fast Fourier analyses to analyze the body structures and make sure that they were rigid. And they handle well. They don't have a lot of body lean. The suspension system is quiet. It's relatively stiff. But Cadillac really did a great job turning this Sauzier into a silk purse. Now, when the Seville was revised in 1980, it went atop an all-new platform, and it had an independent rear suspension and a lot of fancy componentry. And I have to guess that that new platform for the Seville cost way more than this Nova platform did with this live rear axle, leaf spring rear suspension, Chevy Nova based, let's say, platform. But, that 76 to 79 Seville was unquestionably a success, and there were other copycats of it. Clearly, Ford did the same with the Granada and the Versailles. And Chrysler arguably did the same with what was actually a Aspen Volare and turning it into the 81 Imperial. So it spawned some copycats, some successful, some not. But the 76, the 79 Seville was unquestionably a success and a cost-efficient one at that. Let's move on to number 3. And at number 3, we have a more recent example, and this is the redesign of the 1991-1992 C&H body cars. Now, the C&H body cars were the cars that were introduced in 1985, the full-size front-wheel drive cars. In 1985, you had the Olds 98, the Buick Electra, Cadillac DeVille, and Fleetwood. In 1986, you'd have the H-bodies, which would be the Delta 88, Buick LeSabre, and then in 1987, the Pontiac Bonneville. Now, the C-body cars were revised for 1991, the H-bodies for 1992. And so what is the major cost savings here that was so ingenious? Well, take a look now at this 1991 Buick Park Avenue picture. And let's contrast that with a 1990 Buick Park Avenue picture. Now, did you know that both of these cars have all of the same inner sheet metal? The inner black metal on the cars. The door inners is an example. The inner fenders. That's all the same between the two vehicles. Now, the original plan was going to enable all new inner and outer sheet metal for these cars. But later the divisions learned that for cost savings reasons, they were going to have to reuse that inner sheet metal, and all they could do was change the outside of it. And the designers did a brilliant job. Like on this Park Avenue, you have, if you look at the front view, you have the fender that kind of wraps over and comes closer to the hood. And designers created this shoulder with this exterior sheet metal that was able to mate up to the interior sheet metal in the same way as the old car that was a much more formal and upright and boxy design. But they disguised the fact that this sheet metal with this kind of shoulder is mating up with the same inner sheet metal on the backside of it. And it's just a brilliant design overall. I can't believe that these two cars share so many internal components, and yet they look so different. Same wheelbase, by the way, too, and same chassis underpinnings. So it's really just a reskin, but GM got a whole new car out of it. And in fact, I would say, having seen some of the design prototypes that they were thinking of putting out into market before the designers learned that they were going to have to use the same inner sheet metal, I'll actually say that the final design actually ended up being the best one. Despite having to reuse that inner sheet metal and the constraints that put on designers, the cars ended up looking great. And the Bonnevilles, the Park Avenues, the LeSabres, the Oldsmobile 88, 98, I think they're all great designs that have worn well and still look good today, and yet they were birthed out of a necessity to share a lot of components. Let's move on to number 2. At number 2, we have a wonderful GM engine, the GM 3800 V6. Now, the 3.8-liter, I should really say the 3800 V6. The 3800 version was introduced in 1988 when the even-firing 3.8-liter V6, as it was called, got a balance shaft. And that's really what made this engine so loved and so durable and reliable and smooth and everything, was that 3800 revision. Before that, the even-firing V6, I would say, was a 130, 140,000 mile engine. When it became the 3800, it became a 200, 250,000 mile engine, maybe even more in some cases, because a number of internals were also redesigned. And it was much more pleasing to the customer. It was durable and it was smoother with that balance shaft versus the even firing V6. But the GM Buick V6 was actually a cost savings move. It had its roots back in 1962 when Buick was trying to find a cost-efficient alternative to the very expensive 215 cubic inch aluminum V8 that was used in the Buick Special as well as the Olds F85. And so they decided to create a cast iron version of that engine and make it a V6. It's basically a cast ironed, if you will, Buick 215 cubic inch V8. And that was done for cost savings. And back then it didn't have a balance shaft, didn't have the even firing crank. So it was a relatively crude engine, but it worked. And it worked so much that GM ended up selling it off to Kaiser Jeep, and it was used as a Dauntless V6 for a number of years before GM bought it back. Now, GM interestingly sold the V8 that it was the 3.8-liter V6 would be based on to Rover. They would become the Rover V8, used for many years, and that was a very durable V8. But this 3800 V6 had its beginnings as really a cost savings move in 1962 to come up with a more cost-effective engine in the Buick Special. And that ended up birthing the beloved Buick 3800 V6 that, it's too bad. Buick GM ended up replacing this 3800 with the 3.6-liter double overhead cam corporate V6, which wasn't a bad engine per se, but had some timing guide issues, timing chain issues, internal issues, was complicated to service. And the Buick 3800 is just easy to service, runs all day, doesn't complain. It's not a high rever, but it's got great mid-range torque, and it delivers great fuel economy. It's easy to get in a full-size car, 30 miles per gallon on the freeway with this engine. So they really are hard to beat. Of course, they came in supercharged form for a number of years, making up to, I believe, 260 horsepower in the Pontiac Grand Prix applications in some cases when they had the Series 3 supercharged V6. But just a great engine overall. Now that brings us to number one. And what is number one? Well, that is going to be the shared sheet metal on the 1959 GM vehicles. Now, when Chrysler introduced its forward-look cars for 1957, there's an absolutely true story that a bunch of GM designers went down to the Chrysler plant on Mound Road and saw, before they were released to the dealership, what Chrysler was going to introduce for 1957. Just saw the cars being produced and parked out in the lot being shipped to dealers. And the designers were so gobsmacked with the designs, and they thought that what they were designing at the time was going to be so stale compared to these Chrysler designs that they went back and immediately decided that the cars that they were working on, which by this point were for 1959, were just going to be sale-proof, and they had to be redone. And so the designers did a full melt and repour, the so-called Palace coup at General Motors, where they went against the design VP, Harley Earl's wishes and his aesthetic, and created the all-new 59s. Now, because of the timing, in order to execute this, there had to be a number of compromises made. And one of those compromises was that the cars had to use a significant amount of sheet metal and glass in order to get them into production quickly. This was also a significant cost savings move. But if you look, the door glass, the windshields, the backlights, the roof panels, the door inners, they're all shared, the floor plans, and the front doors are also shared based on the Buick design across all the divisions. They had to use that Buick front door. So it's just a brilliant cost savings initiative, and GM would kind of copy this even on the 61 compact cars, I should call them, the senior compact cars, like the Pontiac Tempest, the Olds F85 and Buick Special. They had to use the same front doors and door glass, etc. But it was hugely successful for 1959. The cars did get unique front-end sheet metal, rear-end sheet metal, but they had to reuse a significant portion of that midsection, and it worked out brilliantly. Cars sold well. I think actually it worked too brilliantly because it made GM think that all they could do is change a little bit on the front and the rear, and they could have a different car. And when the car shrunk in size, like in the early 80s, I think this kind of doomed GM to think that they could get enough distinction between the brands when there just wasn't enough real estate to do so. But for 1959, it worked. It was brilliant. People loved the cars. They still look great today. And what else can I say? So put a comment in the comment section if you think that I forgot a particular element here, and which one is your favorite. Let me know. Thanks again for watching.